All right, everybody, welcome back to a commentary on culture. This is podcast number 4. We're going to title this one, The Meek Shall Inherit the Earth. So I was asked, this is actually a great question, and I was going to kind of cover it a little bit already, so it's kind of cool that it came up in conversation. But a friend of mine asked what I thought about, um, basically, a lot of I don't want to say biblical, right? But there's like influences from the many, especially the New Age, kind of the Protestant churches on, kind of focusing inward. I've talked about that to an extent, right? Focusing kind of inward on yourself and kind of how that balances with affecting the world around you, right? Kind of this natural human, emotion, right? Or natural human kind of being drawn anyway to kind of greatness, right? Being great, having something worth, taking pride in and stuff, and how much, the Bible really, kind of tries to clamp down on that. And it's kind of a cool topic, it's kind of a cool thing to discuss because there's a lot of people that constantly push this message, right? That like you are supposed to, be really, submissive, right? Very, very submissive. Let he who has never sinned, cast the first stone, right? Or, turn the other cheek. Judge not lest ye be judged. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord, right? All these examples of passages, right? But, this mentality that, you're not supposed to get involved, this, judge not lest ye be judged, right? How dare you have an opinion? Your job is to focus on yourself, because that's all you can focus on. And, pretty much hiding from, really looking outside, that's especially in the organized Protestant religions, right? Lutheranism is bad, but it's way more so in like the Anglican Church and the Presbyterians and the Episcopals, like Universalist churches, right? Are kind of the continuation of that. They push this really, really heavy message of tolerance and hiding, right? Being very weak, right? Your job is to you don't have a job. Your role, is to kind of step aside and focus on yourself, and the ancient saints, to their credit, talk a lot about that, right? And so I'd like to kind of break that down a little bit, right? So the root of the argument pretty much comes down to, this idea that being a good Christian man is to be harmless, right? To be this, polo wearing, khakis and, tucked in shirt, right? With a nice leather belt, and, speak very, effeminately, right? Your voice isn't very deep, it's, oh yes, 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 Jesus this, Jesus that, well, God loves me, and be very tolerant, oh, this community is hurting, you feel the love, and it's awful, it's just this ilk, right? They just look like these, like a wet noodle, just, oh man, and I should start out by saying that, so I am a practicing Catholic, and I cannot, just shun the Catholic Church from this, right? Literally, in Mass on Sunday, the deacon who was giving the homily was preaching this bullshit, just, oh, well, we need to listen to the gays and the drug addicts, and, we can, learn from among them or whatever, right? Just totally perverting the message. And it's so common. A lot of this comes from, biblical passages that, are meant to kind of cull your pride. Don't take pride. Pride is a sin. Being prideful is a sin. And, this is the instant perversion of it, right? And the reality is the complete opposite. Christ encourages men, urges, right? He wants you to be, not just active, but proactive. He wants you to be, a weapon of the Word of God. So it's it's something that we really need to kind of break down and look at, right? Because there's so many young men that, like, they try and, all right, so, starting with, the red pill stage, right, where things are not, what, these people said they ought to be, or what they said they are. Things are not, this way, and then it kind of progresses to, well, we need to just stop this, stop these little elements or whatever, and then it's like, well, actually, there's a lot of fundamental issues. Maybe we need to take a step back, right, and, change fundamentally, the behemoth that we're looking at, and then it gets back and back and back to this point where it's like, oh, I'm not really defending anything. This progression beyond the Overton window, beyond the programming is what kind of broke me out of the matrix, so to speak. And there has to be some kind of foundation, where did we come from? And eventually, a lot of guys, a lot of young men, kind of get to this point where it's like, well, we need religion, obviously, but how? How do we incorporate this stuff so that, it almost feels like you have to abandon Christianity in order to truly find it, right? You need to right yourself, and become, a monster, so to speak, kind of a behemoth of your own in a way before you can really appreciate this stuff. And, to their credit, that's exactly right. This the slang term for it is, this cucked religion, right? This very submissive version of Christianity, that's very, that views piety as if, you're just supposed to show up to the church, and just chase this emotional love, right? This emotional feeling by being as prostrated to everybody around you as possible, without really understanding the foundations of the church and the foundations of where we came from, and you do need to get away from it. That's what I did. And it's kind of interesting, the full circleness of that. I'm back almost where I started, but in a completely different perspective, of how things should be. And I think part of that is taking into account who the scripture is written for, right? And I covered this in the last couple of podcasts. If you read something or if you hear something, if you see something repeated, right, and it's like you don't have to work on it, if you're, oh, well, I never need to, concentrate on not turning the other cheek, because I'm always submissive. Well, it's probably not meant for you. Right? Think about it, right? Like, if you're able to attain this stuff so easily, if it's easy for you to be submissive, then what's the point of laboring your entire life, to be submissive to Christ? Right? If the St. John of Chrysostom's telling you, well, don't take whores, don't pursue these ulterior paths, well, if you're unattractive, why would that pertain to you? If you are just at the bottom of the barrel and nobody wants you, why would they write that? If that's, what I'm saying? Like, if the message was meant for people who don't need to hear it, then it's a moot point. And obviously you need to hear the message. So, that's kind of where I back stuff up to. And if we're going to if we're going to, I guess, inspect this from a scriptural standpoint, right? Which, don't get me wrong, I'm not like ordained in the Catholic Church. This is just some stuff that I've read that's kind of helped me, kind of deal with this. And then we'll kind of talk about the progression of, the dichotomy, right? Of pursuing greatness, but not pursuing, pride, so to speak. So I'm going to start out with a couple scriptural examples. Right, so behold, I have given you the authority to tread on serpents, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall harm you. Nevertheless, rejoice in this not, that the spirits are subject unto you, but that your names are written in heaven. This is Luke 10:19. And then my other favorite one, so I actually just discovered this one a couple weeks ago. I've been using it as like motivation to work out a lot. But St. Paul writes, I discipline my body and make it my slave, so after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. Fundamentally here, the point of these two scriptures, right, is, who is he talking to and why? Well, if you're meek, and your job is to, live this simple life where you don't focus on anything else, and you're never, trying to change the world because it's unchangeable anyway, then why would he tell you that? Why would they write that? Why would it matter that he disciplines his body to make it his slave so that, after he preaches to others, he will not be disqualified, right? Why does it matter that, he's telling you, I have the authority to tread on serpents, right? To stamp out evil, to go into the evil homes and destroy them. Why would he say that? So when I'm obviously not coming at anybody who has this mindset as if they're stupid, right? We were all lied to, we were all misled. And so it's important to take this and realize that, the ancient church didn't believe this, right? The ancient saints didn't believe this. They didn't have this idea that you were supposed to do nothing. In fact, they were very outward in their influence, right? And they realized, the importance of, that duality there between heaven and earth, right? And fulfilling your earthly duties, and doing the best job on earth that you possibly can. And the transcendent good above all of it, that obviously you can never obtain, but you should always strive for, right? So, and so going back, right? So another one, another passage that's kind of been perverted is one that I actually just used, right? So the full passage here is basically Paul talking about, I believe it's Paul. Yeah, Paul talking about, making himself a slave to all, right? That's another one that they use. Well, you need to be a servant to all man. You can't have standards because you need to take care of, their needs and stuff, right? And you do, but not in that way. Being a slave to all men is doing your job, doing your duty, right? How is a king a slave to all men? Well, he leads above his example. He is the example above his own earthly desires, right? Because he has the opportunity to take all this stuff and enjoy it, to whatever end he wants. He is a slave to all men by rising above that and being their leader despite all of the opportunities he has to become morally corrupt and to pursue it. And so that's a little bit of foreshadowing that we're going to get into here in a bit. So, I guess to further kind of hammer this point home, though, so I'm going to expand on that last little piece of scripture that I was reading there. So, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. So they do it to obtain a perishable wealth, but we an imperishable wealth. Therefore I run in such a way as to not run aimlessly. I box in such a way as to avoid hitting the air. But I strictly discipline my body to make it my slave, so that, after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. So this kind of gets into that greatness, right? Talking about being, an influential character among your peers and, kind of pursuing the roles that you're cut out for, right? And this kind of branches off into a duality here, so yeah, you are supposed to excel at everything, right? You are supposed to be an instrument of, a perfect higher power, right? And we see this, constantly recycled throughout Christian history, most of which is Catholic, right? So if you're not Catholic, take that with a grain of salt. But, the truth is that, if you're looking at, for example, right, the old churches, the ones built by the Byzantines and, and the Latins, right, Latin Catholics, way back when, before the Crusades even, how intricate they are, how beautiful they are, and where the Renaissance came from. Not that everything that came out of the Renaissance was good, right, but for example, the art and stuff, Michelangelo, and the perfection of, describing the individual, right? I think a great example of this is that, a lot of the sculptures, right, in Europe, and in the ancient world and, kind of the medieval world were naked. They were nude. And at the time, today you couldn't do that, right? Because we live in such a corrupt time that like it would just be a sex symbol, right? But at the time, right, they were so disciplined, but, I guess I'm kind of getting off track here, but the point is that their society was so moral that they could do these things and have these beautiful sculptures of the human body without it being sexualized, right? So that's kind of getting back into an exposition of you're supposed to be excellent. These people were not mundane. They weren't concerned about only living, being a farmer, right? Not to say that, that's not bad, right? I'm not saying that being a farmer is bad, but, living in a way that, simplicity is the above, the kind of the end all, right? It was simplicity as far as, they don't have these, very, kind of an educated palate, right? They don't have these, wants that are, constantly being satisfied, so they got these multitude of dopamine paths or whatever, right? Like Michelangelo would never look at, some woman, dousing herself with, bananas and milk or whatever and think it was sexual, right? Because he is so honed on what he's doing, and it's so, well, it's such an intense, dedication that, like, in order for his brain to accomplish those things, he couldn't stay in that carnal realm, right? So that's kind of where we're going with that. So, it's important to realize that, you have a place, and the Stoics talked about this a lot, and that's kind of where the conversation with my friend went, is that, Stoicism was it was so foundationally close to the Roman Empire, sorry, not the Stoic was part of the Roman Empire, right? It was kind of their theology there for a bit, or their philosophy. It was so fundamentally close to Christianity that, there's kind of a back and forth, between, in fact, in a lot of ways, Christianity kind of absorbed Stoicism into it, right? John, famously, the first words in the book of John are, God is with the Logos, and the Logos is with God, right? Translated English is the word, because Logos means word in Greek. You have a role here on earth, right? And your job is to pursue that role as totally and as aggressively as possible, right? But at the same time, there's a kind of a duality with that, right? Because you can't just leave your family in disrepair, and you can't just abandon, the simple values, right? The simple topics of, self-improvement, right? And self-knowledge and self-discipline, because we're building off of those things, and just trade it for, these extra adventures, right? And that's a kind of a common theme, honestly. If we're looking at, European history, a lot of, the big downfalls of the major empires, kind of came down to that, right? It was no longer about, the greatness of the empire, or, in the Middle Ages, the will of God. Now it was about a lot of personal prestige, and then, well, it's kind of, it's the way that all sin is the wages of death, right? That's kind of a degenerative influence, and it's kind of like building your house on sand. So let me see if I can. I don't know if I hit all the points. I know I hit quite a bit of them there, but the idea basically is that you're not an isolationist, right? It's kind of a, you can't just abandon your morals, right? And just say, well, all gays are bad, and just go on a gay massacring campaign, right? And at the same time, not that, that's necessarily the answer. I don't want to, I probably shouldn't use that as an example. How should I put this? So you wouldn't want to say, we need to exterminate all the gossipers, right? And then, let yourself fall into sin in other ways, right? I think a great example of this is, our secular culture's, love of usury, right? Our secular culture loves their interest rates. You hear it all the time. Well, you're not going to get anywhere, if you don't invest, and get, this 10% return back for, just letting someone use your money. Like it's silly, right? You can't escape it anywhere, right? But at the same time, a lot of these people, they look at, some of these other sins, and they're like, well, we need to aggressively eliminate them from society, right? So that's kind of what it's talking about, is that you can't just, abandon your foundation, right? You can't just knock the walls over to kill somebody on the other side or whatever, to stop, somebody from getting in your house. That's kind of stupid. And it gets perverted because people take this and they run with it to a point where, like for example, Paul saying, I'm a slave to all men, right? They run with it to a point where, you're no longer a self-respecting individual, right? And to their credit, the Bible does talk a lot about pride, but they misinterpret it so that, like, it's no one can have pride, right? There is no pride at all pride is evil, right? And that's not the case. That's not the case at all. And I think a great example of this would be, the ruling monarchs of the Middle Ages, which I just kind of talked about, but, kind of expanding on that a little bit. When they did things solely for themselves, it generally, to some extent, came at the cost of the empire, right? So, but at the same time, that level of, dedication by everyone underneath them was necessary in order to build, Western Europe, in order to build all of what we consider today, kind of civilization, for 2,000 years, to build up civilization from a bunch of mud huts and people who would dance around fires naked and chase pigs in the woods, right? To these multi-layered, super complex societies, with extremely ornate and intricate architecture and, incredible depth to, everything, right? Art, music, dancing, spoken word, and like all this stuff, poetry, right? And at the same time, not lose themselves in it, not become, kind of enamored with their own creation. And for 2,000 years, that was largely the case. Obviously, they're, especially lately, right? Things have really gotten off track, and the ends have kind of justified the means in a lot of those cases. But for most of human history, most of Western history, that was not the case. And this is kind of the reason why, is that, there is a very important dichotomy to explain that, it's not about you, it's about your transcendent purpose. And at the same time, so you are making yourself, I guess, how do I put this, right? It's not for your own ends, right? But at the same time, your role matters, like your body is a temple of God. Right, but at the same time, so what that means is, you're not treating it like an amusement park, right? You're not getting drunk every day, and you're not smoking, and you're not, covering it with, just ridiculous tattoos that mean nothing, right? There's just, there's a million examples, when you think of someone not treating their body like a temple, just eating horrible food and letting themselves get fat, right? Like Paul is very explicit, your job as a Christian man is to be, the tip of the sword. Only one person wins the race. Well, the euphemism there is that you're the one person and you have to outrun everybody else, right? And it's a sports, analogy, it's a sports metaphor, because you're athletic. He's talking to people who would take that, right? He's talking to the people who are the tip of the spear, who are the top 1%, right? Your job is to push yourself, so that you are exhibiting the characteristics of someone who is at the top, not just exhibit, it's not a mind game, right? But, you are acting out who you're supposed to be, and that's, at the same time, it's not for your own ends, right? So we've talked a lot about, how leaders have kind of abandoned their role in society, right? And now it's kind of, they're using their power, to fulfill all of their crazy desires, right? Just to the point where it's just so beyond obscene. Literally Hunter Biden's uploading, sex tapes of him and his niece, right, on Pornhub, and the only thing that, I don't know, this is, I guess, like a separate topic, but, that kind of speaks to the point, right? These people are just so insane, absolutely insane, they're just degeneracy at levels that, I don't think anybody really considered possible. The average person on the street, if you said, hey, do you want to have sex with your niece? They'd look at you like you're insane, because you are, but these people are just so exposed to, any dopamine rush that they could ever want, that, it's just that spiral to the point where the only way they can get it is by being taboo, because there's like a little bit of a rush that comes from it, right? And that's why it's called sin, is because if you follow it to its extent, you get extremes like this, and there is no self-control at all, right? So, that's kind of what it's talking about. That's kind of what we're talking about. And your role in society is to be virtuous, is um, to be the best, right? To be the tip of the spear, to be at the top of the spectrum, the top of the hierarchy, but at the same time to accept your role where it is, and you're not pursuing anything simply because of your prestige, right? If you're chasing something because you need to be the best, right? Because it's your mission on earth, right? That's acceptable, right? But the moment you start getting into these personal disputes, right? And these personal or matters of personal pride, where, well, we're gonna build stuff for the sake of me, right? And this concept of self-worship, elevating yourself to be a god in its own way, now you've kind of lost the music, right? And that's well, it's kind of leads to its own end right there, right? It's once you break the contract, if you're at that position, why should anyone beneath you continue to follow it? So, but the point of this, is to kind of talk about, there's such an influence from Christianity about focusing on yourself, right? And so there is kind of that dichotomy there, right? You are focusing on yourself. You are pushing yourself to be the best that you can be, but you're never going to be the best that you can be in a vacuum, right? You're never going to be, like, what's that one? The one scripture or whatever where the guy's talking about, the servant who puts the gold in the ground gets nothing, but the guy who invests it basically is, he gets a return for his money and makes it grow or whatever. That's a euphemism, right, for taking your gifts and spreading them, and pushing them out to the world, right, and building up your community in the local area kind of around you, right? And so if you're like me and you're a young man and you're kind of sitting here staring at this stuff going, well, how do I, deal with this? How do I kind of put this into perspective? That's where I would kind of start, right? Is that, you have a job, you have a purpose here, obviously, because you're here and nothing happens as an accident. There are no accidents. And so your job is to, your perspective essentially is to find, your place in this society and excel at it. Find your role here and excel at it, but excel at it in a way that's constructive, right? And so we're going to talk about somebody here in a second who kind of fits this exactly. So King Louis the 19th was the only canonized king of France, and he's been internationally renowned, right? Internationally is kind of a key word there. You ever heard of St. Louis? Renowned for his moral character, right? And his piety, and his obvious submission to, the Word of God in a way that it was pretty exactly as intended, right? So we're examining this from, the perspective that, for so many years now, we've been told repeatedly that, the only good way to be a Christian man is to, be this super, wimpy and, unimposing character. And this is, part of the reason that, I like Christian or Catholicism so much and Eastern Orthodoxy so much is because it, the veneration of the saints is extremely important, because if you don't have, any kind of elevation of these people, it's, or the Lutheran idea that everybody is a saint, right? You're basically operating under the pretense that, this man was no better than, than I am, right? And that's totally wrong. But that's beside the point. So this guy was so venerated because, he was in a position of power, right? And so from this new age mindset, he's supposed to just kind of give everything up, and just kind of let it all get, dispersed as God sees fit, and just bend over backwards to, at the cost of himself, be a slave to everyone else. In a lot of ways he does, but not in that context, right? Not in this super cringy, God is love and, here's all my stuff kind of a thing. He venerated his position in the hierarchy, right? He was a French king, not just a French king. He kicked off, the golden century of St. Louis, right? Up until that point, it was the largest and wealthiest kingdom in Europe and the largest and wealthiest kingdom in French history at that point. Obviously, later, you know, with the rise of wealth and stuff, it kind of changed over time. But um, super important character in French history. Kind of starts out, his career, on the Seventh Crusade, and is of such a high character that when he's captured by the Sultan, he brokers his own release from captivity. And when the Sultan's aides, kind of object to it because who in their right mind is going to listen to somebody that they have, in captive, right? Being held at the point of their sword or whatever. Who's going to listen to them when they say, well, I'll pay you my own ransom, and leaves to go do it, right? Rationally, any person looking at that's going to go, duh. It's kind of a self-defeating mindset. But, the Sultan believes him because of the sheer weight of his character, right? And he kind of transposes this on all Christians and says that, he's a Christian and Christians don't lie. And he's right, at that point in time. Louis goes off and pays for his own ransom. So the point is that you're exemplifying this level of character, right? And you're excelling in your role. So Louis the 19th wasn't content to basically be a pious Christian, and sit in the convent, or not the convent, but sit in the monastery, right? Sit in his kingdom and not do anything with it. He was pushing the boundaries of it, but at the same time that he was pushing the boundaries, he's leading crusades, waging war against the English. He's not letting his foundation, right? He's not letting the bedrock of his kingdom go to waste, which was a common complaint of other Christian kings, like, for example, Richard the Lionheart, who my family crusaded, earned the stars on the family crest from, joining their crusade. He was accused of bankrupting, the English crown or whatever, right? To pay for waging war against I don't even remember who it was now. It was the Mamelukes or something. The Muslim hordes, right? So Louis doesn't do that. He's considered a saint because at the same time as he leads foreign campaigns, as he inserts himself into the world, right, to declare the supremacy of Christ, he builds up, his kingdom. He takes a very, part of the reason that he builds up his kingdom, part of the reason that kicks off so profoundly, and they enter this golden age is because he bans usury. His economic policies, made not, so he's viewed as being the wealthiest king of Europe at the time, right? But it's not, he doesn't view it as his wealth, right? He views it as the kingdom's wealth, but not in like a communist, distributive way. He has an important place at the top of that hierarchy and he venerates it. He takes a lot of effort to, on both ends, right? To glorify that position and make it worth respecting, right? And at the same time, earning that respect from, all of his piety, right? And all of his service to his people. So in this time period, some of the most intricate, right? I'm trying to think of the words. I'm kind of failing myself here. I guess the most famous pieces of French artwork, right? The landmarks of France, are really kind of coming to their own during his reign. He's a huge funder of the arts, or not funder, what is it? Penchant of the arts or whatever. He funds them, right? He bankrolls, artists, throughout the nation. which that's an important topic in itself, right? Because we so often associate art, and creativeness with, this anti-religion, hippie vibes, and that wasn't the case, right? These are the artists that he's bankrolling, right? That he's paying to, and commissioning to produce these works of art. They're basically paying homage to the kingdom, right? And artistically purifying, the minds of their countrymen, so to speak, right? In the same way that you become what you watch, through like TV and games, and the content, of the plot lines and stuff. It's kind of the same for at a much lower level. That artwork, right? So he's commissioning these people to, to kind of spruce up the kingdom, so to speak, right? On a very fundamental level. Yeah, huge patron of the arts, and he takes his role as kind of head justice very seriously, right? And that's a huge deal. That's kind of the whole point that we're talking about right here, is that, not necessarily to strive for power that's not yours, right? But to take the power that you have and, use it to be as morally incorruptible as possible, right? And so that's kind of where his reputation comes from, is, he's viewed as, this morally incorruptible character throughout Europe. His people are, they're fanatical for this guy, because when, he pursues justice despite, all of the things that get in the way, which at the time was, more royal relationships and stuff. And, today you would say it's more like, social constraints, right? So, he's pursuing, well, I guess I shouldn't say he's pursuing, right? So he's, clamps down really hard on, palace excesses, right? But at the same time commissions painters and sculptors to, to venerate these places, right? So, well, it's kind of a weird dichotomy, and it's, kind of what we're talking about. He's not making it beautiful for his own, urges, right? It's not because he likes, the insane, pursuit of wealth, right? Like the royalty, and all of their excesses, right? He's not pursuing them, for the sake of, his own dopamine. He's not pursuing it because, it kicks off a chemical reaction in his brain. He's like, oh, that's pretty good, and keeps going. He's pursuing it because it strengthens the position of the king of that time, right? Or the king of his nation. And, by doing that, strengthens the integrity of the nation itself. And so at the same time, while he's building that up, and doing a lot of effort putting a lot of effort into strengthening, the crown that way, at the same time, he's dedicates, a lot of effort to servicing, even the lowest levels of the empire, right? So he part of the reason that he was canonized was because he was known for, bringing people into his house, right? The royal castle, and, feeding them. At the time, obviously, this is a kind of a rough period in European history, which most of European history is pretty rough. There's a lot of people that are starving or very poor, and he's taking care of them. So that's kind of a little bit about him. So using his example, right? Kind of talking about the way that you should approach piety as kind of this modern incarnation, and kind of a godless age, right? So the first thing to take away from this would be direction. He had a vision for where he wanted France to be, and it wasn't one that kind of revolved around his, carnal desires, right? It wasn't one that was very focused on, venerating him as a person, right? When they made statues of him later on, it wasn't during his life, he wasn't utilizing, the suffering of the French people, right, to to put himself on a pedestal, which is kind of where they're getting at with, the whole be simple, don't ever show pride and stuff like that, right? But it's the second, the duality of that, the follow up, that's the important part, is that you are in a power or a place of power, right? You are in a role that has influence, and it's extremely important, right, that you're using your ability to discern, the right way to do things, to do exactly that, right? To kind of push, to move the ball down the court in the right direction. And the second way, or the second thing to kind of take from his example is discipline. He was kind of known as the monk king, even though he wasn't a monk. He had I believe like 10 children. 11 children. Now some of them died in infancy, but still 11 children. One wife who is also very aggressively Catholic, right? Very, very profound. And so the point here is, you don't have to live this ascetic lifestyle, right? You don't have to, cut yourself off from the world, right? He lived in the world. He had a family, and, he valued his role so, I shouldn't say he valued it, right? But he placed such a strong importance, right, on his role as a father. He wrote his son a collection of many letters, showing, telling him how to be a man, telling him, explaining things that he felt, he wasn't able to explain as well in person. He invested very heavily in his children and in their welfare, and not just in their tangible welfare, right? Like, a roof over their heads and, food on the table, obviously, in their spiritual growth and in their well-being, from the standpoint of, from his standpoint, right? As their dad, in their long-term success and stuff. And then lastly, empathy, right? So, the original question that kicked all this off, right, was, how do you take this stuff in? Because this is in a lot of ways, it is still, it seems like such a contradiction, to talk about, having power and utilizing it, and pursuing, pursuing your, I don't want to say talents, right, but your opportunities, I guess I'll say, pursuing them to their fullest extent. How do you do that without losing, kind of your humanity, right? Without losing that requirement to be, very, very focused on yourself, right? And the big way to do that, or the big takeaway, right? That we can get from King Louis the 19th is empathy. The incredible amount of empathy that he had for a lot of his less fortunate peers, his countrymen, that he considered it his duty to lead them to the greatest success that he could possibly deliver, right? And so that's kind of part of the reason that he was canonized, right? So he was obviously, took care of the poor and, used the proceeds from a lot of his campaigns to pay for, the families of the soldiers who died for him and stuff. So lots of very virtuous behavior. But the reason that he was largely canonized was because of his own, not just his empathy, but going back, his direction and his discipline. These kind of all three came together, and that's why he became a saint, in the Catholic Church. And he was viewed as kind of the ideal ruler, right? So that's why this is, in my opinion, I think probably the most accessible example. There's some other ones too, like Charlemagne's a great example. Let's see, Richard the Lionhearted. Even later, there is a number of other ruling monarchs and stuff that were very personally invested. Peter the Great, right, of Russia, even Napoleon. Some of the the people that are kind of considered the black sheep of history, right? That were extremely dedicated to the well-being and the success of their home and their communities and their families and stuff, right? These are kind of the examples that we have to follow. And to kind of close this out, we're not talking about just like revolution stuff, right? We're not talking about flipping the hierarchy on its head, you know, and telling everybody that they need to pursue being that top dog. Like that's not excelling in your role is not the same as trying to pursue this radical level of equality, right? Trying to flip the script on the world. That's not the case, right? And that's not the case at all. And that's not how you should be looking at this. Your job is not to grow up and look for opportunities to exert yourself, right? It's to kind of organically from the ground up build a foundation on which you can basically that you can directly and indirectly influence those around you. You're looked on as an asset to the team rather than kind of a rogue player trying to take control. So that's kind of where the dichotomy of it kind of comes out again. It's kind of a recurring theme. There is kind of a give and a take. You're accepting your role in society and where you are, and you're excelling at it. But at the same time, you're by excelling at it, right? You're naturally, the goal is to move to kind of the head of the pack, or to excel above your peers. But at that's the dichotomy is that you don't want to necessarily destroy the hierarchy. You're just doing as best you can where you are, right? So that you're in the right place, at the right time to influence things as they you get the opportunity. But the most important thing is that it's not for yourself. It's for a cause that's greater than yourself, which is where we get the multitude of Christian teachings on this. Let's see. So that's pretty cool. That was probably the end of my big topic. I guess I could talk about some current event stuff. I don't know. Although, if you're listening to this, the current event is probably already over, just like the Chauvin verdict. Yeah, let's see. I mean, Canada doesn't look like they're doing so hot. This thing so I don't. It seems like people seem to think that this AstroTurf BLM rally in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, is going to be like I don't know, kind of a cover for what's going on down in Maricopa County. I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I think it's just the beast, being let out of its cage. I'm really not a big fan of this idea that, everything is fake or, inorganic, so to speak. It's like they've sown enough of the, I don't know. They've sown the seeds enough, like they've put us in such a condition where this stuff can just grow out of nothing that, it's like, I don't know. I don't necessarily think that it's like a weapon right now. But, that's kind of fun. That's kind of a fun topic. So how should, I don't know, how sorry should you really feel for, drug dealers that get shot by the cops? Apparently you should be pretty upset about it. I mean, where does that go, right? What if you take that one to its conclusion? I mean, there's been, so many innocent people, innocent white people that have just been executed, awfully, in just absolutely barbaric ways for no apparent reason. And I mean, ugh. Like just the insanity of it, right? But you're supposed to be mad, because I don't know, some dude, who's an awful person, just a low life, right? Just gets capped, just put down, and it's a big deal. It's just, that stuff is just so funny to me. I don't know how people take it seriously, but the reality is it's kind of the world that we're living in. The big term these days is anarcho tyranny, right? It's the basically the state, allowing, one team is allowed to play ball, right? The other team has to sit on the bench. We both know what team is allowed to play ball and what team has to sit on the bench, right? And what really where does that go? I don't think anybody really wants to talk about that because nowhere nice. I'll put it that way. Historically speaking, anytime something like this has ever been allowed, it's never gone in a way that was good long term. Um, I don't know. I mean, I guess that's where the first like 3/4 of this podcast comes into play, right? It's That's why we're talking about what we're talking about. Because I mean, this stuff, it's endless and it's just like right in front of your face all the time. It's not even like I really need to post stuff anymore. Everybody knows it's happening. You know, I mean, literally no one cares what the truth is. They literally still use Mike Brown as an example of police injustice, right? When Mike Brown was literally like verifiably over and over and over, they've proven that he was not shot the way they said he was shot. And, they still use this guy as, an example. It's just dumb. It's just so insane to try to digest it. It's like, well, you know, if there's any credence to the movement at all, why wouldn't they just abandon that example? Well, because it gives them momentum, because enough people, when you stand up and you say something against these guys, when you tell them that they're wrong, or, oh, that's not true. Statistically, that's not true. You know, the point is not to rationally argue until, the most logical argument comes out, right? They're using the power of rational argument as a weapon. They don't want to find out what the rational answer is. They want to expose who the rational thinkers are, who's not afraid of the mob, so that they can silence you, right? So they can, move you out of the way and flag you for later. They want to find out who the troublemakers are because they're gonna win, right? And they know what they're about once they've won. They know what they want to do, and they want to know right now who is in the way. And they use each of these examples. Each of these insane instances, right? You find out later that, literally the whole story is a lie. Every single time, Breonna Taylor and, George Floyd and, there's a couple, Freddie Gray and, just a couple from a couple years ago that, I mean, it's just insane, right? Just dumb. You find out later on the whole thing is just a giant crock of shit, just totally made up. And, it's like, well, what's the purpose of it? Well, they're winning and they want to find out who you are so they can shut you up. Remove opposition, right, to their progression. And, I mean, I don't know. How are you supposed to look at it? It's like, you can't not say anything, right? But at the same time, arguing with these people is a waste of time. So who should you argue with? Well, probably people who are going to listen. People who, that look at the vaccines and they go, why am I going to insert, the ones that are thinkers. That's who you build up with first, right? Those are the ones that you can argue with. And that's why we're talking about, that's why I'm trying to use this podcast as, kind of a means to talk about, Christianity and stuff, and the foundation of our culture. Because, if we can get enough people to kind of have a positive view of this, we have something, right? We can come back from this. We can kind of, have a little bit of a bulwark, right? We need something to advance ourselves down the road. It can't just be, we just need to stop the enemy, right? Because that's why they're winning and that's why we're not. I guess that was ultimately where I was going. It doesn't, their examples don't matter, right? Because their fundamental truth is that they don't care. The white system is going away because of demographics and, they need to replace it. And basically it's out of necessity, right? If they don't replace it now, if they don't jump in, when they can, but in this short little period before Hispanic dominance, just a couple decades down the road, they're not going to have a chance. Not that these people are that forward thinking, but it makes so much sense. A lot of it is subconscious. Like they're going off of what they can feel, and what they can feel is right. They sense vulnerability. They sense vulnerability, and they're making a move on it. Because they have to. because they really don't have a place in the world, right? They really don't have a way to, meaningfully contribute on an equal scale. So they have to secure it as best as they possibly can. And this is how they're going about that. So, I don't know. I mean, I guess I really wasn't trying to talk about this stuff too much. I should probably cool it because there's just, it's just so inflammatory, right? People just go so insane when you start talking about this stuff. But the reality is, where we need to be, our team, right? Where we need to be is, when these things come out, when it comes out, oh, the police in Elizabeth City won't release the body cam. Oh, they shot this guy in the back of the head. The proper response is, who cares? Who cares? I don't care. Look them right in the face. I don't care. They could shoot 1,000 drug dealers. I don't care. I do not, have a dog in that fight. Because it happens all the time to a white person, and nobody says anything, right? And the game has changed. It's not our country anymore. America is gone, whether or not you want to admit it. You don't have a voice. You don't have a vote. You don't, it doesn't matter, how much money you make or, what team has the better argument. It's literally just demographics, so the way we win is while we're still the majority, hop on board that train and say, okay, nope, we're pursuing things that, benefit my demographic, right? And that's kind of how we get back to this. That's the short-term solution, and the long-term solution is, we've fallen off societally. We've fallen off the track of godliness, so to speak, right? We have abandoned, the idea of state-enforced morality for so long, that, I mean, we have to get back to that at some point, right? That's kind of the long game. The short game is, we need to start doing things that benefit us, and cops killing drug dealers, cool, excellent, absolutely, awesome. I don't care, that's sweet, as long as they're executing drug dealers instead of like the cops out here and, breaking the arms on, 73-year-old dementia patients. I mean, there's a time and a place to be mad about police brutality, right? And it's not when it's hurting somebody that already hates you, and I mean, the evidence for that is so overwhelming. I think everybody knows it. The moment that you live in like a majority black area, I mean, you figure it out pretty quick. They don't like you. They hate you, and it's for nothing that you've done. In a lot of cases, it's literally just because you're not them. Because they think of you as weak, right? Because they've been culturally conditioned to think of you as weak through all of the ridiculous movies and shit, and songs and, the dominance of their culture over our own, which is completely astroturfed, which means, it's completely just artificial, it's fake. It's not because it's better, right? It's because, somebody controls the algorithms, to, what's popular and what's not popular. And, so I guess where I was going with is they hate you, right? They look at you and they're like, oh, a target. They look at white suburbia as, kind of ripe for the taking, plunder. And, I mean, as long as that's the case, as long as they're separate, as they view themselves as separate, and that goes for any minority in the country, right? As long as they view themselves as a separate entity outside of our culture, they're the enemy, unfortunately. And it's really sad to say that because, I come from a long line of servicemen. My family's been here since, the earliest my family has been here is going back to the 1700s. Most of my family emigrated from Europe throughout the 1800s, right? So for a long time, a very long time. And it's like, it really pains me to say that, that this nation that, my blood has been spilled to protect, right, is dead. But it is. The idea that we're all on the same playing field and we all have the same access to, a system that's going to represent us is false. It's gone. And as long as we keep pretending that, that a black drug dealer getting shot, even if it's in the back of the head over a ditch, I don't care. Like that's like anywhere near as much of our concern as, for example, um, that white guy down in Phoenix who somebody called the cops and on a domestic, said he was like beating his wife or something, and then he like answered the door with a gun and put it down, and they still shot him. you know that is directly applicable to you, right? Here where near where I live, there was a video a little while ago of the some police officers basically jumping this dude in a hospital room, with his infant daughter, because somebody, completely unsubstantiated, accounts of what happened. They didn't arrest him or anything. They basically tased him and beat the shit out of him because he wouldn't turn over his phone. Like those, that's what matters. And there is a time and a place to come down on the police and say, you guys are not doing your jobs. I don't support the police for this reason. But when they're killing drug dealers is not the time to do that, right? When they're cleaning house, and like putting dudes under their knees for 9 minutes, I don't care. When they're shooting through doors or whatever and they kill drug dealers that are, that literally hate you, that want to rape and plunder your family, who cares, dude? Why? Why do you defend these guys? And truth be told, pretty much anybody with their head on straight has figured that out. But it needs to be said, and it can't be said enough, right? It's like we need to play for our team. We need to look at each other, figure out, who's on what side, because there's a lot of people who look like me that are just idiots. They just go on and on and on about the system and reparations and, like this concept of equity and justice, and it's just like, just shut them out. They're not on your team, and that's the other kind of sad part. I guess that's where I'm going with that is like, just leftism in general is just a disease. Like the moment somebody is infected with leftism, that not just, yeah. So I guess I should back up there, right? Because women a lot of times are kind of, they lean to left a little bit because they're naturally distributive. They're naturally liberal, right? A woman who is liberal in your house is a relatively good thing, right? Because she shouldn't be trying to, be a masculine, right? Which is traditionally conservative. That's typically men adopt more, masculine features, which typically correlates more with conservatism. And women, on the other hand, are typically more liberal. But leftism is like that on steroids, when that becomes allowed to be dominant. Like it's just a disease. You really got to protect yourself from these people because they will come down on you. They will, they don't view you as family, right? They don't view you as their friend. They view you as, basically someone to be corrupted, or someone, like kind of like a target, to wage, their woke jihad on, which, that's kind of a fun topic in itself, right? Which I'm probably just going from, jumping from topic to topic here, but that's okay. So that's kind of a fun one, right? Because there's a lot of people who look with a lot of angst. They look at what's happening right now and they're like, holy shit, is this really another religion? Is this the continuation of Christianity? Maybe I'm wrong. And the answer is absolutely not. You are absolutely not wrong. You are absolutely, not the evil. You're not the real bad guy, I promise. People look at, for example, there's a lot of shit in the news about how, George Floyd is the new, Jesus, right? The new John the Baptist or whatever, executed for being, a whatever, right? A prophet of wokeness. And when you examine it, even superficially, from a macro level, it doesn't even make any sense, right? Christianity had, just extremely dense layers of philosophy behind it. Like literally it's been 2,000 years of stuff that has still, like there's still room to philosophically apply it to the modern age, and it was at its heart, right, was constructive. Christ built the church, when the Christians went out, they put, the reason that their message was so pervasive, right, and didn't need culture to reinforce it was because it was the truth. and they were seeking out people who wanted to hear the truth, right? Which I guess I should have covered that when I was talking about before I was talking about King Louis, when I was talking about the early Christians and their associations with Stoicism. So the reason that Christianity latched on so quickly to the Romans, right, was because the Romans so they had their gods, right, which they stole from the Greeks. But the reason that they used them was because the Greeks are very philosophical, right, and they kind of incorporated that level of philosophy into their culture. So like is it Epicurus, and there's a couple other ones. I forget the guy that actually started the concept of Stoicism, but basically it was just like this radical acceptance of the world as it is, right? There's a reason for everything to happen, and everything around you is so complex, right? There are so many millions of chemical reactions and biological processes, right, that have to happen each second, right? Each second in the smallest organisms in order for the world to function. That there's no way that it's not, that was basically the reasoning, right? Is that there's no way that there's not something driving that. And that, that flowed very evenly with Christianity, right? That was an easy jump for people. And it was very shit on, right? It was very oppressed, seriously oppressed, right? And whereas, none of this, the woke revolution has never been oppressed, literally ever. Even when, it was cops out there with German shepherds and fire hoses, the only reason they were out there doing that was because they were already winning. This goes back so far, literally. I think to put this in perspective, the 1940s, right? I think the best example is the Tuskegee Airmen, right? This was an idea by one of President Roosevelt's advisors, right, as a PR mission. Where they decided that, they wanted to push the black vote, right? So they were going to, well, not push the black, they wanted to get more of the black vote, right? They wanted to show that they were progressive, as opposed to fascism, right? Which was very, order and hierarchical and stuff. They were trying to be as progressive as possible. So they put together this group of above average African Americans, and decided to teach them how to fly. And once they were done learning how to fly, so they started in 1942, right? And they didn't get done until early 1945. So there's a couple red flags there, right? Because normally pilot training was taking 6 months. So that's kind of fun. That's a fun little rabbit hole to go down. So, these guys get done with their training and they get sent overseas. And originally they're attached to the 8th Air Force, right? Which, if you're familiar at all with World War II history, that's the mighty 8th, right? They're the guys who are flying, daily combat raids into Germany from the modern day UK, right? From Great Britain. And that's important because the 8th Air Force suffered the highest amount of casualties. Literally the 8th Air Force lost more airmen in the skies over France and Germany than the Marine Corps lost in the campaigns in the Pacific. It was a very, very violent place to be. So, well, it's a war, right? So the whole place is violent. But, the point is that, it was, survival rates were not very high, right? That was the real battlefield. And by 1945, the war had already largely been won. This is literally after the Battle of the Bulge that these guys are committed to combat. And immediately they're pulled off the line and sent south, to Italy. And so, on the Italian front, right? Which at that point in time, any person that is even remotely familiar with the war, all of this mythos that's been built around these people is, these mavericks, right? They're better than everybody, this, that, and the other. And just a macro examination of that is well, if they're so much better, then why were they put into combat, pulled out of combat in the hard part, right? The Germans were still fighting very aggressively in Germany, in Belgium and Germany, and why were they pushed down south where the war was pretty much over? I don't even think they were committing resources to the Italian front anymore at that point. So, the point is that, in this, it's the same thing, on the ground with the ground units. It's the same thing going back to World War One and the Harlem Hellfighters, and just ridiculous claims that just come out, that were around back then, right? They were obviously nowhere near as influential back then, right? Because the American veterans came home after World War One and basically laid waste to a lot of minority communities. But the lie started way, way, way back then, and it's been consistently pushed by some very influential people, right, for a very long time now. So it's when you're looking at this, and you're seeing these people, tout this bullshit, it's literally all just smoke and mirrors. It's all fake. And, the longer that, I don't know, it's so dumb, just like watching this stuff. I mean, I feel bad because, I know that there's a lot of people, like, I'm probably a little bit of an outlier, not to, talk myself up, right? But, I've read a lot of books, and what's more important is, like, I've retained a lot more of the knowledge than I think that, than a lot of people do, unfortunately. So it's been a little bit easier for me to just look at this stuff and go, what the fuck? Like, no, that's not the case, because I am stuck with my level of autism, thankfully, allows me to still function in society. That's kind of a joke. But, I mean, looking at this stuff is just so fucking insane, man. I don't know, and where does it go, That's, South Africa, right? To a point where, they're literally going to be able to execute you in front of your family. I mean, I guarantee that we'll see people like, the guy that killed Cannon Hinnant, he'll get off. In our lifetime, he'll be released from prison. Same thing for, the guy who's on the death row for, using a wrestling move to kill that toddler in Texas, white toddler in Texas. He'll get off. This is the world that we're in, right? So it's like, how do you approach this stuff? What do you do? And I don't really think that anybody has the answer. I don't know that I necessarily have the answer even, despite, my many attempts to convince everybody that I know everything. I think it comes down, though, to, that's kind of a tough, that's a tough subject to really get in. I should probably invest a little bit more time into coming up with an answer for that one. But it's like, so it starts at the fundamental level. A lot of people have really picked up on that. For starters, it starts with yourself. The reason that we're here is because, people became, so morally corrupt over time that they allowed themselves to, vote for, to be used essentially to advance, civilization destroying things, like for example, right, the 19th Amendment, right? Or even earlier, going back, Lincoln himself was a huge opponent, right, to, letting the freed slaves vote. He thought it was a horrible idea, and he also didn't want them to continue to, integrate into, or be allowed to continue to integrate into what he considered white society at the time, because he thought that it would lead to, cultural disjunction, I guess, and, ultimately the destruction of the country. And he was right. He was entirely right. And that's kind of the battle lines that, we've been subject to, is it's come down to a battle of the minorities, right? And their own ethnic interests. So, I mean, where do you go? How do you fix it? Well, you start, at that individual level, right? And you fix yourself first, and you allow yourself to be made into, what is ultimately incorruptible. That's what's important, is that you're incorruptible. They can show you whatever stupid shit they want. They can show you whatever emotional video they want, because it's going to get to a point where there are death squads, right? And it's going to get ugly. At some point in time, normal men and women, unfortunately women, right, which I totally like, do not let your wife participate in that shit. Keep her away. Go home. Go back. I hate to say go back to the kitchen, but like, go somewhere else and just sit, wait it out. Don't, just so dumb. But, the reality is that, enough of these fucking MAGA idiots, decided to sign on to, this Ashley Babbitt, thing. Like, Ashley Babbitt should not have been there. And she's a murderer, don't get me wrong. It's a horrible, perversion of justice that she was killed. But it's like, why are you there, right? And so, I don't know. That's its own tangent. It's going to get to a point where, these men and women, feel the need to act, right? And it's going to get ugly because they don't have, the part of the angle here, right, that, in Elizabeth City especially, is they're playing, the cultural, expectations of the city against the rural resources, of these small towns, right? Not rural but these limited resources, I guess, of rural communities. It is metropolitan United States versus rural United States, and this is so self-evident, right? If you watch the video, that they've released so far, it's a SWAT team rolling up in a pickup truck. Like, it's rural America. This is how things in rural America are handled. And it's not bad, right? They're not as clean cut. They don't have endless resources. They don't have 3,000 cops on the payroll. It's a tiny town with a little budget. They're expecting these guys to go out and train on their own. Not that they're, above criticism. I don't want to give that vibe either. But, this idea that, they're expecting, for example, the NYPD has, something to the tune of like 30,000 officers or 300,000 officers or something like that, and like 15,000, crisis negotiators, and, like a ton of SWAT teams, and like helicopters and tanks and like all this other shit, to where that guy essentially, would have been taken alive, right? Because just the sheer amount of overwhelming force would have paralyzed him. And the argument is that, well, rural America needs that too. But rural America can't pay for it, right? So how are they going to do that? Well, first it's going to start at the state level, but ultimately, the state level might be it. I don't know. With the way things are going, I don't think it'll stay that way because, even if things are at the state level, right? If they kind of mandate that, there are no more rural police departments, or it's kind of expected that the state takes over. There's just too many red states. There's too many red states that are, like Kansas, right, and Nebraska, or North Dakota, that it really wouldn't be, that the locals would be pissed, because they'd be like, why is this Yahoo from Bismarck up here in Minot telling me what to do, right? But, it wouldn't suit their purpose, like what their goal eventually, right, is to create, a centralized police force to where rural communities, because they know who's in the rural communities, they know who you are, they know where you live, they know what you eat, they know everything about you, right? They know your demographic profile, and they know that if you are allowed to govern yourself, they can't do what they want, right? You can break away, in rural America, even where I live right now, there are enough people here, where they could literally break away, and a sizable amount of them, could produce enough livestock and food to support this place. It's self-sustaining. They have their own, natural gas and oil production and stuff. We could, literally function as our own independent state, right? But that's, as long as, we are atomized, and as long as there is centralized control, they can't do that. They can't push that. So that's kind of their goal, right? And it's through that atomization that's making that happen. But the angle right there, that's kind of where I was going with the whole Elizabeth City thing. The angle is to, weaken the rural governments, right? And not just, it's the rural government, right? But, by extension, anybody who lives in a rural community, and make them dependent on the cities for everything, right? Because once you're dependent on the cities, once they remove that local, independence, um, now you're done. That now, I mean, it's a political thing, right? But it's also a cultural thing. They own everything. They own your methods of communication. They own your halls of government. They own your tax rates. They own who's voting for what gun control measures. And the big thing is they own who is going to insert what minority into what neighborhood. That was kind of a sleeper, right? That people really didn't pick up on. The Biden administration, removed, it's not just the carrot anymore, right? With the tax incentives for all the low income housing and high density housing and low density areas, right? Which is red, minority housing in white areas. It's now, there's kind of the stick as well, right? Now they're going, we won't grant you, federal funds for states and cities. We won't, and the state level there, we won't grant your permits to build unless you build Section 8 housing. So at that point, I mean, obviously, the first thing that people look at is voting, right? That would totally shift the game, for voting, that totally shift the spectrum. But more importantly, that would destroy the communities. That would atomize your communities. So not only does it destroy your voting block, right, but it destroys your community integrity, which is exactly what they want, which is why it's so important that they destroy rural community and rural law enforcement, right? Because those are the things that are really standing in the way, because if they just come in and they just, start throwing up Section 8 housing, well, rural cops are not as read up on, all of this social justice bullshit as city cops, right? The metropolitan police are not your friends, right? And rural cops, as a point of comparison, really aren't your enemy. And so, when they get rid of that, that's kind of, that stops you from doing anything. That stops you from seriously fighting against it or putting up any kind of serious resistance. Once I guess I should take a step back here. They know who is, getting around the gun laws. They know where they're getting around the gun laws. They know how they're getting around, gun laws, voting, like all the stuff that they're using to control, the people, right? Whether it's, food regulation or ammunition regulation, and in some states, magazines for firearms and stuff. They know who's doing that shit, and they know the reason that they're getting around it is because, the rural cops are on the same page. They don't see it as a detriment to their community to enforce or to not enforce those laws, right? And so they don't. And that's what's going away, right? So that's kind of the macro picture here. So, coming back to the individual, I mean, it's kind of, going back to what I was saying earlier. That's why it's so important. That like when you see somebody, so the guy's name was Pentland, I guess, not Pennerton, but, like that guy that I was talking about last week, or, the cops in Elizabeth City, or, the Micaiah Bryant thing, which that was, oh my gosh, that was just so dumb. Just so fucking stupid. When you look at this stuff, regardless of how damning, if it was someone who looked like you, I'm not saying to take this line, but if it's someone who doesn't look like you, your first response is, I don't give a shit. I don't care. If it comes out later that, this guy was a veteran, he was super pro-white, pro-American, super pro-Christian values and stuff, okay, let down the walls a little bit, give that guy your support. But never, ever can we be allowed to look at what's happening and be made to hate ourselves, right? We need that unity. We need to come together as a team and say, I'm not going to be used as a weapon against my brother. I'm not going to be used as a weapon against somebody that if it were me in that situation, they would be standing up for me, right? And this is a fun, so in addition to the story that I was talking about the other day when I was recording this, so Sergeant Pentland, the girl that he was going to intervene on behalf of was black, not white. Which is, I said she was white, right? Which kind of fits a narrative, which I had read that. So in my defense, the article that I read was wrong. And no, I'm not updating my sources, because if they're 85% right, that's good enough for me, as long as they're not pushing some stupid fucking agenda. Um, so she was black, like that changes the dynamic, like you want to talk about unreturned loyalty. That is the example. Excuse me, my phone just went off. Well, thanks, Google. Don't care. You know what a betrayal. His neighbors betrayed him. His white neighbors betrayed him because he would have done the same for them, and they're on his team. But like the family that he legitimately went out to defend was one with the mob and chose the mob over him. That's that's just so like mind blowing. Like you want to talk about stereotypes, man. That's just heartbreaking. How awful, dude. That guy like went out of his way, to protect his community. When was thinking himself to be anti-racist. It's not about race. He's got a black neighbor that he's protecting, and they did nothing to protect him. They let him burn. Absolutely let him burn, right? So that just goes to show, like goes to show a lot of horrible things. And I wish it weren't true. You have any idea how much I wish that wasn't a fucking black person that totally just, betrayed that guy? How cool would it be for the stereotype not to be true? And there are exceptions. There's that black kid, a little while ago that saved that, the two white kids from the burning house, but how many times, does that have to be proven to be the exception, to the rule? How many times does that have to happen before, you realize that there's a rule there? Like, I don't know. I just, I feel so bad for that guy, dude, because I see so many of my friends in that position. Looking outside, these are the guys, they get mad when there's drug dealers in their neighborhood. They get angry when they see, I don't know, just people going around, causing problems. They're the ones that come outside and they're like, what are you doing here? If you want to be a thug, go be a thug somewhere else. And, they're the kind of person that would have inserted themselves into that position. I don't know, just really, really sad. You want to talk about the state of the Western world, man. How are you supposed to come back from that, right? How am I supposed to view my black neighbors, as legitimate neighbors, right? How am I supposed to view them as people who will give as much as they will take when stuff like that happens? Because I don't have a lot of options. And that's, it's not just me, I'm theoretically, it's not just me, right? It's everybody. This time of wealth is over. This period of exorbitance is gone. Of plenty is over. Austerity is here. And we don't have, the breathing room to test this out over and over and over. And Sergeant Penland is a great example of that, right? He gave these people a chance. He put his life, literally his life, on the line to protect them because he thought that, they were just like him because they were both Americans. I'm sure they came over for barbecues. I'm sure they came over and hung out. They had a good time together. And, what happened? Well, he got burned. In the worst way, he got burned. And it's like, to some extent, you got to be forgiving, right? And you got to be a good neighbor. But on the other, you don't owe people anything if they're not going to give back to you. And that, is a actually kind of a fundamental part of Christianity. There's charity and stuff, right? But, at no point in time do they say, give your lives for people that, are not going to give back to you. No, you're not a slave. You're not, you're a slave to all men by doing your duties, right? You're not a slave as far as you're not a human sacrifice, to just be expended for no reason. No rational person has ever thought that, so, I don't know. It's so sad just to look at that from the macro level, right? And at the same time, they're willing to just destroy that guy's reputation in life, and we're going to riot over, some drug dealer who got shot down in North Carolina. Oh man, there's so much else to talk about in that way too, because it's like, what demographics of people, support Black Lives Matter. What demographic of people, support, like, and I don't mean just black people, right? Like, well, although, that's a fun topic, right? So Black Lives Matter has obviously become a black nationalist movement. They've consistently been shown to, operate so far outside the constraints of reality that it's like you can't take them serious. You can't take anything serious that they say. But over the course of the race riots last summer, their approval rating went among black Americans from 92% to 96%. So, what does that tell you? Their support only went up against in African communities, right? But their narrative has been completely destroyed, by Ben Shapiro. Not really, but consistently over and over and over. It's always wrong every single time. Always, always, always wrong. In a rational world, in a country governed by rational men, they would have been dispensed with already. They're a black nationalist terrorist group, and their supporters would have been, dealt with, right? But, who supports them? Why are they still around? Well, unfortunately, they're overwhelmingly supported by liberals, by white women especially. And that kind of comes back to, why are white women so, aggressive about that? Why is their nature, push them to be that way? And yeah, there's a lot of reasons for it, but ultimately it's because, the men, the white men, right, have kind of fallen off the wagon being men, and they've been helped, with the insane divorce laws, and the insane, just destruction of traditional culture. But largely, we've lost our place as, the patriarch of the community. And, we've been replaced by, this state-run behemoth that's influenced by people it shouldn't be influenced by. So the end result here is like, I don't know, the destruction of our culture, the destruction of our society. So, I don't know. I mean, how do you prepare for that, though? I don't know. I honestly don't have an answer for it. Because the truth is that there's nowhere you can run. That's I 100% support getting off the system, right? And building a chicken coop in your backyard and raising chickens. 110%. I am totally on board with that. But, the reality is that, you are never, ever going to get farther away from the system in 2021 than Randy Weaver was able to get away from the system in 1993, 1992, whenever that was. Think about that for a minute. That guy moved, so he was a white nationalist, right? Which, if you listen to him talk, it's kind of sad how right he's been proven, that the races of people cannot live among each other. They can't. They can't. I mean, because, once you let, I don't know, which, that's a totally separate argument. But it's like, once you let, this one culture, have some kind of equality against, your culture, now you have to accommodate it, and that's exactly what we've done, and what have we gotten for it? Well, now our police are afraid to arrest black people and our crime rates are through the roof. And also, if you pull a gun to defend yourself, now that you have to, you're probably going to go to jail. So, this guy he sees this coming. He was a special forces soldier during the I believe the 70s, the 60s and 70s. And he was right in a lot of, unfortunately, right? So he decides he's going to leave. He decides he's going to bounce. And he doesn't want to be part of society anymore. So he moves to a mountaintop, on Ruby Ridge, right? On a ridge top or whatever, in the middle of nowhere, Idaho, and the ATF tracks him down and, pretty much, fabricates some stupid, fake gun charge, like total entrapment. I mean, it's just absurd. Why they ever thought they could get away with this, I don't know. Any rational person sitting there looking at this, would just throw it out immediately, right? Not anymore though, because now he's white. So they show up and they put a, they try to arrest, they supposedly try to arrest them. Really, they try to ambush them, right? Except, they're feds, so they're used to their offices and not, the woods of Idaho. So they get, snuck up on by his son, who shoots like two of them and then dies, unfortunately. So basically, long story short, right? They kill his son, kill his wife while she's holding, her baby in her arms. And I mean, it's just awful. The whole story is awful, right? Eventually the siege ends. He goes to prison, and eventually the feds wind up paying him a ton of money. And but it doesn't bring your family back, right? But the point is that this guy tried to leave. He tried to leave. Where else was he gonna go? I don't know if you've ever been to Idaho. I have. I've flown over it. I've driven through it, and like there's really not too many other places. If you can't, I guess I should put this like, if you can't get lost in Idaho, if you can't go somewhere where nobody's going to find you in Idaho, there's nowhere on earth that you're going to hide. Honestly. Because it's just so far out of the way. The roads are impassable in some places. It's like Montana's kind of the same thing, right? And they did the same thing. A number of different, militia groups or whatever that arguably, were trying to do what a lot of right-wingers are telling their followers to do, form communities and form militias. Yeah, well, they did that. And what happened? The feds came in and killed them, concocted a bunch of stupid bullshit, killed a lot of innocent people. And, so what do you do about it? Going forward, it's like, you can't run. You can't just form a homestead in the middle of nowhere. You're never going to find a refuge. And even if you do, they're going to move in immigrants. They're going to move in Somalis. They're going to move in, not even Somalis. When I lived in Wisconsin, Wisconsin during Hurricane Katrina. And afterwards, right? So they did this really cool thing where they moved, people, survivors from Katrina around the country, right? And Madison was one of the places that they chose. And it literally took working class white neighborhoods and turned them into shitholes within like not even a year, not even a couple years. I mean, so I left a couple years after that, my family moved away. And I remember, one of the ways that they were going to change that was by changing the name of the streets, right? They thought that the name, it's almost like putting up basketball hoops, right? Just stupid. They thought that the name of the street was what caused the violence. And, people looked at that and they went along with it. They totally went along with it. But, my point there was to say that, like, there's nowhere you're going to hide. They're doing this right now already. They're going to places, in Idaho and, dropping off, thousands of immigrants, from, in that case from Somalia, right? But throughout the country, illegal migrants, flying them from the southern border to Maine, flying them from the southern border to, Alaska, right? Like, why would you fly a Mexican migrant to Alaska, right? Doesn't make any sense. But the point is that there's nowhere you can run. There's nowhere you can go. So what do? If you talk about it too loudly, too many people will notice and they'll crush you, right? So, I don't know that I really have an answer to that one, but at the same time, you have to say something. You have to stand up and you have to talk. You have to make a coherent argument, and you don't need to be super intelligent. For starters, you already are more intelligent than all the people around you, whether or not you want to admit it. I guarantee you're a lot smarter than you give yourself credit for. It really doesn't take a lot of brain power to crush these guys. You have to just approach it from the standpoint of, what benefits my community, and literally the whole thing falls apart, and that's, when you're out talking to people. I think so. That's kind of the steps to this, right? So maybe they're not totally wrong. I mean, they're right to an extent. Like the way we get around this, not necessarily get around this. The way we get through this is, we identify the issues in ourselves. We fix ourselves. We build strong families, right? That's the big one. Is it goes beyond just a strong community, right? It's a strong bloodline. And After that, then we build strong communities. And then from there, now we really get to organize. Now we really get to create our own no-go zones and, places for these people where we're safe and they're not, right? And unfortunately, that's the only way that, we get to be safe. That's the only way that we get to live in neighborhoods where, you don't have to worry every time somebody goes outside, to take the trash out. Which is such a real thing, so there's a lot of people that I think, there's people who listen to this from a lot of different places, wildly different places. And if you're from the Pacific Northwest or the Midwest, the upper Midwest, unless you lived in an urban area, right, like Portland or Milwaukee or, the Twin Cities, you don't really know what it's like to live, in a place where, your safety is a legitimate concern all the time. Even in nice neighborhoods, right? Like I think, a great example, the Micaiah Bryant shooting. That was not in a slum. It was at a foster house, right? But that wasn't in a slum. Those were nice houses. Those are, I don't know. I don't even like here anyway. They'd be like $300,000-$400,000 houses, if not higher, if not more expensive, you know. So, I mean, to compare it, these houses are. Well, I guess I shouldn't talk about that. The point is that in these places, especially down south, it's literally as simple as turning down the wrong road, and these wrong roads are everywhere. They're everywhere. And, literally at that point, your life is really in danger. If you're a young woman, you are in a serious danger of being raped. If you are a young man, you are in a serious danger of being, accosted, right? Or mugged or robbed. And if there's even the slightest, uprising, even the slightest upheaval, like they're out for blood. They're out to get you, which, I don't know, shouldn't really be that much of a surprise. So there's so many examples, and of people going out, and they see somebody breaking into their neighbor's house. They're like, hey, what are you doing? They get shot 6 times, night watchmen, going out and asking questions, or hey, who are you, blame, you're dead, like it's really, really sad, and it happens so regularly, and you never hear about any of it, and that's coming everywhere, right? So how do you deal with it? Well, to some extent, you just gotta sit tight, so while we're building up our communities and stuff, while we're building up ourselves, you gotta sit tight, and you gotta keep your head on a swivel, and you need to. This is what I'm trying to start with. I'm getting better at it. We need to focus first on identifying people who are like-minded, right? And what I mean by that is, people who don't buy into the bullshit. When they see, a car roll up the street, and it's either falling apart and, has a fresh tint, right? Or it's got the hoopty rims on it, right? And the, just filling the whole neighborhood full of rap music, they look at it with disgust. Like those are the kinds of people that, we need to latch on to. Not the wide-eyed idiots that sit there and go, oh, maybe he's a nice person. We all need to be judged by the content of our character. Oh, that's a fun one. Yeah. If a certain somebody was judged by the content of his character, they would have judged him as a rapist instead of a instead of a figurehead. Oh man, I don't know. I should probably stop talking about red pills so much. It's just so much fun, It's a good time. I like talking about this cultural stuff, but it just takes so much extra effort, because it's like you have to. I guess to some extent, I've only got like just a toehold on this stuff. Like my fingertips are barely over the edge, and I'm hanging on. I've got a grasp on it now, but it's like, man. Like I don't know it as well as, just breaking apart, the world around us, and kind of dissecting, these cultural influences around us. Like the talking about the bad, I guess, is a lot easier than talking about the good. So I don't know. I have to put a lot more effort into that next time. But I mean, this has been fun though. Let's see. I don't know. I don't really know what else there is to kind of. I mean, you just keep going over that one, right? You gotta find people who are like minded first, right? And build relationships with them. And it's not just people who are like minded, right? It's people who are like minded, capable, and understand that it's not it's not a joke. This isn't a game. We could lose our jobs for just talking about this, right? And that's kind of evidence of why we're losing. Is that, I mean, people talk about a civil war coming up, and it's like the other side can openly organize. They can hold black nationalist rallies. They can hold communist rallies. In public, in the open, they can tell you about it. You can take time off of work to go. And meanwhile, we have to be anonymous. We have to hide. We have to, we have to pretend, right, that, well, not pretend, right? I'm not saying like hide who you are, but, we can't be in the open. I can't go up and down the street, and talk about, hey, have you ever, heard the statistic that, 9 out of 10 interracial murders, are black on white? Or like you can't talk about that stuff, because someone will track you down, and that's your job, that's your life, that's your family, that they'll go after. So that's it's not a civil war, right? We're barely just trying to get the team together right now, and the other side's already playing ball. So well, that's kind of where it starts though, right? Is you need to find people who understand it's not a joke, and we need to get on the same page. And I think to some extent that's going to involve some moving, right? We're going to have to move places, not away. We're not moving away from people. We're moving, in some cases to, some of these hot zones to be near people who are on the same team. We need people who we can call on. Like if you live in rural Idaho and you don't know your neighbors, you're in deep, deep shit, because when they move in the Somalis, and they start doing what Somalis do, you're in trouble, because you don't know anybody. There's no one else around. But if you move to the outskirts of Chicago, because 5 people that live within a 10-mile area of each other that are all on the same page, you're doing okay. You're in a better, I would say a better condition, right? Because, in my mind anyway, right, if I am in just being around and being aggressive, right? Being, standing up straight, essentially, right? Not bending down to these people is like 90% of the battle. The blood memories are there, dude. All you got to do is kick them in. Stand up straight and don't let them fucking talk down to you. Don't let them win. Don't let them think that they're equals, because they're not. You got to maintain that, that mindset, that you are the top dog. And, just being around, and not necessarily being outnumbered, right? Or being outnumbered, but having a fighting chance because you've got multiple people that are there to get you, puts you on a different playing field than if you are by yourself, right? Which, it's kind of been a consistent theme that I've tried to address. It's just kind of tough though, because it's like, how do you do that, right? You got to uproot and move to this new area. The pandemic is, not done destroying everything yet. The economy is dead, which is exactly what they wanted. So their goal was, to get you to a point where you were atomized, right, to chase money, and now you're too poor to move home. And if you move home, you're ostracized because of all the cultural degradation at home. So I don't know. All right. Well, it's been almost 2 hours, so my throat's getting kind of dry. I guess I have water right here. I think it is really important, though. So the stuff I was talking about at the beginning, even if I wasn't necessarily like the voice that you needed to hear on that, I mean, there's so many out there. Like the truth is that, you are supposed to be the best that you can be, and you are supposed to be, you know, um, you are supposed to be the pinnacle, right, of your culture. And if you're not the pinnacle of it, you need to orient yourself to try to be the pinnacle of your culture, of your community, right, and of your society. And you know, uh, it's all about the intent, right? Like you can kill somebody if it's for the right reasons. It's okay, right? I mean, that's kind of the premise behind joining the military, isn't it? And the truth is that the Anabaptists and their radical peacenik agenda, right? The radical aversion to violence. And this is my big complaint with Protestants, right? Is now I was a Protestant for many years. I should say that, is that somebody has to fight. Somebody has to be the ugly character. Somebody has to kind of bear the burden of that responsibility. And a lot of Protestant Christianity pretty much strips you of that. It takes it away, which is ironic because they, like, the Anabaptists and the Presbyterians and the Anglicans had no problem subjecting the world to some pretty horrible stuff for a while, and then now they just kind of abandon that. Now it's just it's like escapism, right? They're trying to escape as far away from they can, as far away as they can from from the early church, right? From the church in the years when they needed to do something, because the reality is that the Crusades were entirely required, like they had to do something. The Muslims were, kicking ass and taking names. They were an unstoppable surge across, the Holy Land, but also into Western Europe, and that's really where the Crusades got started. The first Crusade was kind of split, right? It was, there was a really good series on that, El Cid and the First Crusade. They split between the East and the East and West, right? The Spanish were exempt from the First Crusade because the Pope considered it a crusade to free Spain of Muslim rule, right? Like it, at the time, Christianity was under siege. Christendom was under siege, from all angles. The Mongols were pouring in from the east. The Muslims were pouring in from the south. And in a lot of ways, it closely mirrored what's happening today, except there was nobody to actually fight, or stop this from happening. At the time, they just kind of, now anyway, we're just kind of rolling over and accepting it. But back then, they had some serious organization still. I shouldn't even say that. They really didn't. I mean, that's why El Cid was such an important character, right? Is because he was unique among his peers, as an accomplished military leader, and he didn't really get, the discipline and the support from his troops, until he really proved himself in battle. And that's kind of where we're moving to, right? As the institution kind of collapses, we're moving away from, the industrial, faceless rank, right? Just anybody and everybody who has bars or, a certain amount of, hierarchy on their shoulder is supposed to be such and such a leader, and we're really getting back to, which is ironic, right? Because like, that's kind of when the iconic characters were born, during that age, right? Because they stood out so much among their peers. But we're moving away from that system, kind of back to a system where it's literally about who has the biggest balls and who stands up, and who is that natural leader that is, that is worthy, I guess, of your sacrifice, right, as a follower. So, not all bad. There's a lot of good in that. But all right, well, I'm probably gonna call it. I think that's enough for today. So, if you're watching this, or if you're listening to this, I mean, I don't know. Share with your friends, I guess, but share with the good ones, right? We're not trying to red pill people. We're trying to keep everybody on the same page. That's already at least halfway there. And yeah, I think that's about it. So Until next time, see ya.